Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Gathering for Justice ongoing virtual town hall series, We Keep Us Safe. My name is Carmen Perez Jordan, and I am the president and CEO of the Gathering for Justice. I'm actually calling in from the Napi land, which is known as Manhattan. For those of you who don't know, the Gathering for Justice was founded by the legendary artist and activist Harry Belafonte in 2005, after he saw a story on the news about a 5-year-old Black girl in Florida being handcuffed in her classroom for throwing a tantrum. After realizing that children of color were being brutalized by police across the nation, despite the work done by his peers during the civil rights movement, Mr. Belafonte brought together movement elders and youth from all across the United States to form a covenant to end child incarceration and dismantle the systemic racism in our criminal justice system. The Gathering for Justice just celebrated our 16th anniversary at the end of August, and I can honestly say that we have been busier and have had more of an ambitious agenda than ever before. Much of our work takes place at the intersections of racial justice and social justice, but the We Keep Us Safe series was specifically developed to be a platform for our community and extended family to share their ideas and collaborate on some of the most pressing issues facing our communities, even issues such as climate crisis, which might not appear to be related to our work, but it absolutely is connected. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited that my team put together tonight's program. You're going to hear from an exceptional panel of thought leaders, activists, community leaders, who each bring a unique perspective to the issue of environmental racism. And the conversation is going to be moderated by my good friend and dear brother, Michael Blake. Before this dynamic panel comes on, I want to send love and prayers to our brother Ramin and his mother, and to all our siblings out in the world who are suffering. Just know that we hold you in our hearts and in our prayers. And now, let me introduce to you Michael. As many of you know, Michael Blake was born and raised in the Bronx and has dedicated his life to fighting for his community and all communities like it. As an aide to President Obama, Blake was part of the team that passed the Affordable Care Act. He also created the White House Urban Entrepreneurship Series to create jobs in cities across the country. In 2014, Blake was elected to represent New York's 79th Assembly District as New York State's Assemblyman. In that role, Blake played a key role in passing crucial reforms to the state's criminal justice system. I will also say he kind of, allowed us to play the inside-outside game a little too well, passing one of the most ambitious climate change bills in America's history, bringing President Obama's My Brother's Keeper program to New York to support young men of color, securing millions of dollars to improve public housing, and so much more. Blake now continues to make change with some of the private sector's most forward-thinking leaders and executives. Blake still lives in the Bronx and cheers for the Yankees. Boo! Welcome, Michael. So, what's going on? So,
I'm gonna let that ride. I'm gonna let that.
I know. Oh my God. So some might wonder what your connection is to the subject of environmental racism. But as a community leader, can you tell me and our audience a little bit about why this subject is important to you, to the Bronx, and why you decided to accept our invitation to lead this conversation?
Well, I always accept whenever Carmen asks me to do things. And then when Carmen and Jules and the entire Gathering team, I'm definitely in. So love to you, sis, for everything that you're doing. And I'm grateful for you. Look, everybody, we appreciate you all being here. And as Carmen mentioned, to Ramin and his entire family, we're going to keep them lifted up. And we'll leave that there. We're in a space where, as a kid born and raised in the Bronx, everything I'm thinking about is the challenges we've had when it comes to health. And I'm outside and I wanted to be intentional about this and coming straight back from DC, where a lot of us have been trying to fight for changes because of environmental racism, is because for too long, as Senator Warnock has said, we are battling two items, of COVID-19 and COVID-16-19. And so the challenges around how can we breathe? You know, we've been struggling, Carmen, on how can we breathe when it comes to obviously police brutality, but for too long we're struggling when it breathe, how to breathe when it comes to environmental racism and injustice. And in my former work with Green for All, in my current work in the community, this is real, this is tangible for all of us.
Well, I want to thank you so much for moderating this conversation. Now I'm going to pass it to you and all these dynamic panelists, and I'm going to say goodbye to you all. So see you all later.
See you later, Carmen. Carmen got the memo about the perfect backdrop right there for the environmental session. Good evening, everybody. We hope that you're doing well. Blessings to you. Shout out to everybody part of the gathering team. And I am a Bronx kid through and through. So the comment about the Yankees, we're still struggling, but we're going to let that ride. We're going to keep it going anyway. Allow us to get right to it and show love to our panel that is here on tonight to talk through how do we address and change what's going on around environmental racism. Let me go first and foremost to a dear sister from the Bronx, Rosa Alicia Clemente, Black Puerto Rican woman, demonstrates the power of Afro-Latina, not only as an organizer, as a producer, as a journalist, as a scholar. She ran for vice president in 2008 on the Green Party ticket and demonstrated what is possible, making her and Cynthia McKinney the only women of color ticket to run for president in our country. Shout out all day, every day, and everything they're doing. Unapologetic in all that she does. We got to talk about the hip hop that's going on behind you right now, Rosa. We could rap about that as well. Recently, Rosa was a producer. That's right. Show that love right there. Recently, was a producer for Judas and the Black Messiah, obviously written and directed by Shaka King. If you haven't seen it, it was incredibly powerful. It was about the life of Illinois Black Panther Party chairman, Fred Hampton, and how obviously so many came together to take out our leader in that. So we want to amplify the work of what you are doing. And Rosa, to you, grateful to you, my dear sister, great to be with you once again. Take it from the East Coast to the West Coast. Davida Herzl, our CEO, co-founder of Aclima. Under Davida's leadership, Aclima has developed sensing platform that combines cloud computing and machine learning to make sense of the invisible world around us. That just means she's dope, right? That's how you can break that down right there. How do we focus on the scales that have never been before seen at the fraction of the cost? Make it real plain. How do we use sensors to detect air pollution in real time? How can we engage, whether it be connecting with Google, with the US Environmental Protection Agency, how to determine how the methods in June of 2017 were featured in the Environmental Science and Technology report. She has been doing incredible work. We're grateful for what you're doing, Davida, and of course, the recent collaborations between Aclima and Block Power, which I know she'll talk through momentarily. Shout out to Davida Herzl and Aclima. Joel Garcia, my dear brother, grateful to be back with you, an Indigenous artist, cultural organizer, using his talent and his framework to center around those most impacted in our communities, around arts-based strategies, such as paint making, printmaking, installations, creative action, altar making, just to name a few. In various roles, have been able to collaborate and engage the Indigenous community to say, how do we engage across our borders in support of issues of land, of access, and self-determination, which that part obviously resonated the most for us. Someone was saying to us earlier, it's Indigenous Peoples Day, it's Indigenous Peoples Day every single day. Then we can all appreciate that, given where we are as a society in that manner. Doing your creative work in Los Angeles, a fellow of the Monument Lab and Shaping the Past, a partnership between Goethe Institute and the Monument Lab itself, celebrating the German Federal Agency for Civic Education and addressing pressing issues around what, whom, and how we remember our public spaces. Joel, we're grateful for you, my dear brother. Thank you for being in this space with us on today. Last, certainly not least, Ashley K. Shelton. I always appreciate when someone drops in their middle initial. That's when you know dope things are about to happen. I'm Michael Alexander Blake, but I'm gonna let that ride right there. Ashley is our executive director of the Power Coalition, statewide 501c3 table in Louisiana. Power Coalition uses broad-based strategy to combine community organizing, issue advocacy, and civic action, all while increasing the capacity of community organizations throughout the state of Louisiana to sustain and hold the work. I think we can all appreciate Louisiana should be connected to all of us, given all that has been happening there, not just recently, but beyond. Previously, Ashley was the former VP of Programs for Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, where she managed a system of integrated value-added programs in the aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. In that role, she designed, initiated, and coordinated a comprehensive policy strategy that led to systemic multi-pronged approach for equitable policy development, local, state, and national. Needless to say, we have a powerhouse panel. And as a New Yorker, I feel like there's a lot of West Coast love going on out here, but it's all right. We're gonna rock this out, gather for this. Rosa's gonna hold me down so we can make this happen for the East Coast in that manner. So I wanna thank our panelists for being with us. And I'm gonna ask that we dive right in. Everyone that's watching, listening, and following with us right now, this is a conversation to talk through how do we make things happen? We understand there's problems, we understand there's challenges, we understand there's things that are going on, but very concretely, how do we make things better? How do we break what's going on with environmental racism? So let me start right off the gate. Ashley, I'm gonna come to you first. Obviously, the challenges we've seen around Hurricane Ida, most recently on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Can you talk about the damages and the challenges you've seen? But again, how have you been breaking the cycle of environmental racism? How can we go a step further? Ashley, first to you.
Yeah. So, I think that, one of the things that, people, that we didn't think about was that this moment we're in, it's the compounding traumas of both COVID-19, hurricanes, and other natural disasters, as well as, COVID-16, 19, all of those things together have been really traumatic. And I think that it was just like that moment that Louisiana just really had to take a deep breath and that had been kind of struggling with. I mean, the devastation, was unbelievable in lots of places of the state. New Orleans didn't take a direct hit, but then, for our Native brothers and sisters in Terrebonne Parish, all of our Native communities took a direct hit, as well as the river parishes, where we have seen some of the most powerful environmental justice organizing in the country coming out of St. James Parish, also took a direct hit, but also Livingston. And so these places in our community that took direct hits, Grand Isle, Lafourche, and Terrebonne as well, complete devastation. I mean, we still have about 7,500 folks in the state of Louisiana that still don't have power, internet, or clean water to drink. And so there's some real issues around just the damage to the grid, the infrastructure, and things that we're being challenged by, as a state. And I think that what I, have been really pushing back against is this narrative of how resilient we are. And I always tell folks, I don't want to be resilient. Fix the broken things. Resilience is short term. Resilience is not a way of life. I don't want to have to live my life surviving because we refuse to use the federal resources to do the things that we need to do. And I think that, for Louisiana is what we've been fighting for in the aftermath of Ida. First of all, Lake Charles never recovered from Laura. So, I mean, there are all of these these kind of, ongoing losses. And also to this inability for us to center people in disaster recovery, that we think that, disaster recovery becomes disaster capitalism almost instantly. And it's like, we trust businesses. When it came time to do PPP loans, we made sure it happened. We got money to businesses. We trusted people, and we put something on the back end for fraud. But when it comes to people, somehow we can't trust them with direct cash assistance and support to do the things that they need for their families. But we see through the child tax credit and other things that folks make the right decisions for themselves and their families. And that's more of what we need to see. And we've been working with FEMA in the state to make things better for folks on the ground. We had a temporary housing issue. FEMA couldn't get the program up fast enough, and the state stepped in. But the state's using COVID money and other federal resources to make those things happen. So it's certainly a challenge. And I think the bigger piece, for those of us fighting on the ground is that we've done, me personally, I've been through Katrina, Rita, Gustav, BP oil spill, Laura, and Delta, and I forget all of the ones last year. And at the end of the day, the experience feels the same. And so why are we still not addressing all of the issues in the Stafford Act? Why are we not centering people in disaster? Why are we not giving people the things that they need? And why does community and community-based organizations and faith communities have to step up and fill the gap with when you've got a situation where the wounded are helping the wounded?
Actually, I want to stay there because you mentioned FEMA, you mentioned specific pieces right there. Because obviously a lot of what happens is that the federal government's asked to step in afterwards, as opposed to making things better on the front end. And so to how we're breaking environmental racism, what is something you want to see changed federally? And equally, if you can give a concrete example of something that actually worked in your interaction federally for these improvements.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that one of the, I think there are a couple of things, right? I mean, one is that, so again, June 1st, we know it's hurricane season. September 30th, we know, typically we can take a deep breath and season is over. Well, that's no longer true because we've continued to abuse the land and all the things. And so now we've got a season that basically now we have to hold our breath till October 15th to hope that the season is over. But we didn't, no one talks about like one that because of the power that oil and gas has in Louisiana, how much pollution actually happened after Hurricane Ida and how those communities along the river were even more impacted. And, and residents were getting the message that it's just black soot. It's not anything that you should be worried about. And we're like, well, black soot is a pollutant too. Just the sheer language around some of this stuff. And so I think, one thing that for me is going to be critical is that we have to get back to regulation. I mean, there is pretty much the industry regulates itself here, and it just isn't working. And our people are paying the price. And there've been more than enough reports around Cancer Alley. Tulane just released a new report. And so for me, looking at the proactive side, one, we need to create a climate change workforce. Every time it's time to rebuild Louisiana, we are bringing in people from other states to help rebuild the community at the same time that you've got, 50% of Black men unemployed in the city of New Orleans. It doesn't make any sense. And I love my brothers in Mississippi and Texas and wherever they're coming from to get work. But the idea that we're not training up our folks to be a part of a climate change workforce, it doesn't make any sense. I think, one of the other things that, we have been pushing around is looking at the connections between climate change and elections, right? Like the election administration is compromised by climate change because polling locations are closed, directly impacted folks can't be poll workers. And so one successful thing we were able to do was to, really work with the Secretary of State and the governor's office to move the election. We had an election that was supposed to be October 9th. There was no way people were going to be able to participate in that election. And any place, south of New Orleans did not have the capacity to hold any kind of election. And so being able to move that is fine, but I think that now we're working on the state level policies that are going to have to be put in place to address the fact that climate change is going to continue to hurt election administration and the ability for folks to have the voice in the very, democracy that they're living in, and being able to elect decision makers that are going to put them first in the midst of these climate crises we keep finding ourselves in. And so I do think I'm excited to see some of the energy at the national level. Jenny Goldman and a few other folks are working with Organizing Resilience Exchange and others to try to really push around what is the long-term solution. Like we have to stop looking at this as these are just things that are going to happen to us, disaster capitalism, and then we forget about it, and then it's no longer in the news. And like I said, there's still about thousands of people here in Louisiana that still don't have drinking water or electricity. And so I do think that like that workaround, they just address the issue with, clear title and airship within the Stafford Act, which stopped the lower Ninth Ward from being able to recover from Hurricane Katrina. So it's 15 years, late for the Ninth Ward. But again, there's some other changes that we know can be made to the Stafford Act that could allow it to be more flexible and how we rebuild our communities after these types of disasters. And I think the same is true with the COVID. I mean, we did a roadmap to recovery to help stoke some imagination with our elected officials. Like, you've got all of this money, and this money can't just be for police and infrastructure. Like, this money has to be to make people whole on the other side of this pandemic. And so, I consider them both disasters that only the federal government has the capacity and the resources to respond to. And so as community, we have to be able to fight and push them around how critical it is to ensure that some of these dollars get to the ground, because I can tell you from Katrina to today, like one of the hardest things to know is that, like no matter how many philanthropic dollars I had, we had Bush Clinton Katrina funds and others, it didn't matter. It was so dwarfed by the federal dollars. And then, of those federal dollars, how much of it really made it to the ground and how much of it really helped people get back to a place where they were whole. And that just simply hasn't happened, and it continues to not happen. And now I find ourselves, kind of in this moment where, like I think the joint storms of COVID and disaster recovery are, putting Louisiana in a place where we have a lot of work to do, and either we're going to choose to lift our people up, or we're going to have a much bigger conversation and problem on our hands.
And tying these together, and that was powerful, actually, and very specific. Disaster capitalism is obviously going to stay with me and stay with us. Building climate change workforce, which I know Davida can talk about that momentarily. The climate change and election day impact, again, specifics. We want to make sure people leave with that. And the Stafford Act changes there. So we appreciate that absolute clarity there. We're going to have each of the panelists do their opening, and then we're going to make this like conversation. We're going to treat it like you're around the table, and just feel free to jump in once you get in your openings there. I want to go to Joel next. Because Ashley made many references around the people and the land and the references there. And of course, given your work and given the connection to us as a people and indigenous people, Joel, talk us through that process of, one, how do we center, and using arts and culture and intertwining it around centering it, but then equally, how do we take the lessons learned to break the cycles of environmental racism from your lens of perspective, Joel?
Well, thank you, Ashley. That just got my brain going in all kinds of ways. I guess I need to begin by saying I'm here in Los Angeles, what has been known as Tovangar, the LA Basin, but more specifically, I'm here in East LA, what has been known as Apachanga. These are lands that have been taken care of by what we now know as the Tongva, the Gabrielino, the Tataviam, tribal nations that still exist here today. I am an indigenous person, and I see myself, or I locate myself here as an uninvited guest in Los Angeles. And I do my work understanding that my presence here prevents these tribal communities from ever reclaiming their homelands. And I say reclaiming not in a sense of like that they're gonna, kick us out and rebuild a society, but rather that they have agency over the priorities that most affect them. That they have agency in protecting their sacred sites. That they have agency in advancing issues at all levels, right? Not just issues that we determine as a settler society that are indigenous issues. That they have a say-so in the redevelopment of places like the Aloe River, right? Our city has this narrative of like being a desert, and that development here brought water to these lands. And without the lack of development, there wouldn't be any water in the city of Los Angeles to nourish people here. That is a frank lie. This place has been a lush green place that was impacted by the mission system. That cleared mountains, cleared fields to have like single crop farming. So I think understanding that history of like this place where I live is a good place for everybody to begin shifting, not necessarily changing our strategies, but one, pivoting them in a way that center indigenous folks. Also understanding that in some communities, those native folks from that specific area have been relocated to other states. That's hard work, it's not easy. But expanding the definitions of what we call environmental justice, climate issues, because I think first and foremost, we tend to respond and define these off of our settler society of like what's best for our cities in the moment. Not what's best for the communities that have existed here before these cities were erected. And it's always human-centric. Like what is the best for humans, not necessarily what is the best for all living beings. That's hard, difficult work. And I don't want to, I don't want to sugarcoat and say like, yeah, we can just, send all our questions to whatever tribal community we're connected to, because then we'll flood them with all the emotional labor that they have to do and all the knowledge that they have to share with us. I think we can do that on our own. But I do want to say like the art and creative action do play a significant role in doing some of this work. As an artist, we see things differently. We might see points of intervention that as organizers, we don't always see because we're mobilizing from a very strategic place. So the role of artists in this work is super, super important. It is a narrative shift many times that we're involved in helping people bridge understandings and helping people understand what a topic like settler colonialism is and how that can be also weaponized against all folks of color. The notion of being a settler or an unwilling settler or an uninvited guest. These things, white folks have a tendency to weaponize against us, even now in all the like diversity and equity work. We develop this language to help advance our issues and then it gets co-opted. So we have to redevelop it over and over again. But I think art in the way we've used it and the way I've used it is a connector. It's that interpreter of all these ideas that sometimes we seem to kind of clash with. We clash, on ideologies, we clash on our agendas. And one example that I can give you, it actually happened Monday. The city of Los Angeles finally agreed to apologize for all the harm that it's caused to the first people of this area in order to develop the city, the erasure that's taken place. And so the mayor and the council members all went up and gave their speeches that hit all the points, right? Everybody felt good and everything. And a 9-year-old Ellie from the Tongva community who was there was invited to share a couple words. And the beauty of like young folks, right, to like teach us. So she gets up to the podium, fully comfortable, just, the good work that her family has done in giving her the confidence to speak as a young Native woman. And, the question to her was like, why is this moment significant? Like this moment of apologizing and recognizing Indigenous folks. And she said, in short, her speech was like, well, we need to take care of Mother Nature. Like, this is all great, but if at the end of the day, we don't learn how to take care of Mother Nature, then what is it good for? Like that 9-year-old, like, hit it in a way that like, these politicians and other staff members couldn't. Here, Los Angeles is continues to be the largest urban oil field in the country. It is a place where fracking was perfected. It is a place where, it has the largest port, I think in the world, or one of the largest ports in the world, right? San Pedro. So like, we do this work, or I do this work with a sense of responsibility, understanding all of that. Everything from, when it comes to art, like simple strategies, like turning the steps of City Hall into an altar with 700 candles, representing all the folks that have been killed by police. That is an environmental issue. Using altars and inviting different communities. We all have our altar traditions, right? Bringing them together to do that and pay homage not only to all of our ancestors, but to the work that lays before us. Art can be in many ways, or art is that strategy that can bring us all together and help move things in a way that is collective, in a way that is, that centers all these strategies that all of us, incorporate each one teach one. None of us are free until all of us are free. So here in Los Angeles, that's kind of the work that I've committed to. I do that work by working with youth and giving them the tools to be able to do that. And unfortunately, we have a lot of work on our hands here. Some of it has thankfully shifted policy, like this work around monuments and public space and the way they're policed has shifted policy, so that's great. It's good to see that like art and undoing things too. Like we see art as making things, but it's also undoing things, and undoing these systems that are harmful is one of the things that artists can help in doing. I see this as hacking into the system, like Ashley mentioned, there's a lot of support out there that our communities don't get access to. A lot of times because we have these ideas of shame associated to relief. Because we have the ideas of shame, like, oh, you're on welfare, that's shameful. And so one of the things we did was at the start of COVID, when these foundations wouldn't respond to supporting artists, we hacked the system. So we got a bunch of folks on EDD that thought they couldn't get on EDD. And they're like, damn, I'm getting paid more now than I did when I was working for these organizations. Like how unjust that is, So as an artist, I see myself also as a hacker and looking at policy and the loopholes in which we can infiltrate these spaces and put pressure on them using artistic strategies so that these systems break, so that we can build the ones that serve us. And art allows us to do that. It's allowed me to do that here in Los Angeles and across, across borders. So I'll leave it at that.
My looking down is I like to write notes as we do these, because I think all of us obviously do a lot of these, but people need to walk away with something practical. And if y'all saw me moving, it's because of course the rain started to slightly fall on my bald head right here. So I'm trying to make this simultaneous as we're doing this session. The expanding definitions of what's best for our community is already here. Powerful. Artists' points of intervention that organizers don't see. I want to make sure we all internalize that, because Joel said that, but let that really resonate, because as an organizer, I didn't think about it that way until you just said it that way. Turning the steps of City Hall into an altar, to make an altar, a very practical example that Joel just highlighted, so we don't lose sight of that, and how art can undo systems that are harmful. And shame is too often associated with relief, which is so powerful. And too often, many of us obviously saw throughout COVID, relief efforts were being created and people were like, well, I don't want to go get help by that. Like, well, there's nothing wrong getting help. We all need some help in different forms and fashions. Let me tie this together, Joel, with a closing question to you here for an opening. If there is a best practice that you can teach us all, and how art has transformed policy. You started talking about monuments and public spaces. What would be that best practice you want people to walk away from this conversation so they can think about how they implement it in their communities?
I'm going to go to this idea of creating pods that came up also during COVID, which I think is very beautiful. A lot of us who are connected to like also ceremonial circles, like indigenous ceremonies, this is something that is very practical, right? Like when we go to ceremonies, we have to prepare because we're going to be on, sometimes on a remote location for days on end. So we become self-sufficient, we pull our crew together and we take what we need, and then we leave that place with everything that we took. So this idea of self-determination and self-sufficiency. So as communities and artists, how do you create opportunities to pull your pots together, to know who your neighbor is, to do art activities, right? To get out the community out there and know who that, you have a doctor 2 doors down, and then you have a nurse on the other end. And then you have an electrician that lives around the block. Getting to know your community through asset mapping. That's one strategy that I think is super powerful, because at the end of the day, once you start exploring the ripple effects outwards, you start to see how closely sustenance is to you, what trees give fruit, what plants take care of you, and you shorten the loop between going to the store and buying these materials or nurturing them at home, in a garden, in a community garden. So this idea of pod mapping, who do you know, who's in your community that builds this ecosystem of support for you, translates at the end of the day into shortening that loop between consumerism and what we need at home. Not what we want, but what we need. So it's also changing behaviors as to how we consume, because we know that buying shit off the shelves is one of the things that has led to the situation that we're in at the moment. And that was weaponized against us during COVID, right? Because we couldn't buy stuff that we needed. But if we had that stuff at home in some form or another, or shorten the distance between how we get these, these materials, supporting the local store down the street, not the supermarket, not the big box store. These type of strategies are super practical. And as an artist, you're a convener. An artist convenes people. An artist is a curator of energy for programming, right? We always bring in artists, like everybody's doing like art space this or art space that or pop-ups. You know, how many pop-ups for vaccines do we see now where artists are involved in one form or another? They're either painting a mural behind the vaccine booth, they're doing some sort of workshop. So do that in your community and build these pods, build these like self-sustaining communities that also like lead to self-determination. That ripple effect is huge when it comes to the climate crisis.
Pod mapping is going to rock with me from this conversation. After Superstorm Sandy, you know, that's something we saw here in New York. And Davida, I'm gonna come to you next and then go to Rosa. How many people realized that there was support that was near them that they didn't think about before. They didn't make that connection. And the crisis and the emergency led to that, but it wasn't happening before. And so let us all take away pod mapping as something Joel and Ashley both given us gems so far. So, you know, we all got our homework. We are streaming live, everybody, at Gather for Justice, Gather for the number Justice, and Gather New York Justice League. Make sure to remind people on Twitter they can watch us and give those comments. And Joel and Ashley, now that you've given those, feel free to, you know, tweet out some things, keep the conversation going. You know, don't just keep the gems in Louisiana and LA right now. I'm out here. So let's switch it up. Let's go north. Let's go to the Bay. Someone who knows a little bit about data and asset mapping and the importance of how to utilize data for good. Davida, what's happening with Aclima is essential. Obviously, we need to be better on how we're assessing air pollution, yes. But deeper than that is what do we do with it? And so talking about what you have been doing already with Aclima, talking through the partnership and the engagement that you're going to be happening with Block Power, and how does that help break the systems and the cycle environmental racism? Davida, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael. And I just want to ground this in first, thank you to Ashley and to Joel, because I think you said you provided so much wisdom, so many gems, and Joel, your words are so inspiring. And I think just to ground this in terms of what Aclima is solving for, you know, I am inspired by what Joel said. We've gotten so disconnected from nature and our understanding of natural systems. And one of the things that we don't think about is that when it comes to the climate crisis, the same emissions and emissions from fossil fuel burning, those same emissions that are changing our climate and changing the state of our planet and the capacity of Earth systems to sustain life, those same emissions go straight back into our lungs, right? We're like fish in an ocean that have forgotten that we're swimming in water, right? And so those same emissions go back into our lungs, and the same, you know, particles that are changing the state of that atmosphere are causing unprecedented health impacts from, you know, if you've been exposed to higher levels of pollution throughout your lifetime, you're more likely to die from exposure to COVID-19. We now know that pollution impacts everything from fetal development to cognitive function to diabetes to heart disease. It's not just asthma. A lot of people think, oh, you know, air pollution just impacts my lungs. It's one of the reasons that in Louisiana, you see the highest concentrations of cancer outcomes in the entire country because of the level of exposure and proximity to these sources of emissions. And in the United States, because of the history of redlining, so after the Great Depression and the implementation of, you know, federal loan programs to help people buy houses, the country was mapped. I'm going to talk about the impact of mapping, right? And red lines and lines were created around Black and Brown communities. And it designated those communities as more risky for mortgage lenders. And so what ended up happening is that real estate, that land became less valuable, and all of the freeways, all of the big factories, all of the big sources of emissions were placed in those communities. And so as a result, you fast forward, these were practices that started in the 30s. They've since been, you know, technically banned, but we are living with the legacy of those historically racist practices that put Black and Brown communities in proximity to those sources of pollution. And as a result, you now see numbers like, you know, if you are Black in the United States, you're 3 times more likely to die from disease that is induced by exposure to air pollution. Here in, you cited our ESNT paper, Michael. That paper showed that pollution varies up to 800% from block to block. And so what that means is that emissions are hyperlocal, and your exposure to those emissions have impacts on long-term health, because you can experience exposure to hotspots that are very different from, different communities that are far away from those sources. And so we just did another study that just published, for example, and this is in the Bay Area, right, where we found that on average, so in the Bay Area, Black and Brown communities were exposed to levels of pollution that were 30% higher than the average, and white communities were exposed to levels of pollution that were 14% lower than the average. And so one of the key, you asked, Ashley, how do we deal with these issues? Where do we start? So I start with, three different parts of the equation. And for me, one of the most critical pieces is transparency. Joel talked about the power of mapping, and we need transparency to understand those disparate impacts. And so what we've done at Aclima is that we've developed a new technology and a new approach to how air quality is measured and how emissions are measured at the block by block level. And so we can measure all the regulated air pollutants that are regulated under the Clean Air Act, except for lead, but the main criteria pollutants. We can do we can measure greenhouse gases, and we can understand them at this really hyper local level, so that we understand two really critical questions: where are emissions coming from? And two, who are they impacting? Because when you think about investments in fixing the problem, we really need to understand where are those problems, and we need data plays a really critical role in making those issues transparent, clear, obvious, and then to be able to create frameworks for accountability, right? So data plays a really, really important role in doing that. And when you look at the way that, as we're confronting the climate crisis as a nation, as a world, we are missing the data and measurement infrastructure to create those systems of accountability. We don't have it. In the United States, again, pointing to Cancer Alley, there's just a few, you have one of the highest concentrations of toxics and polluting facilities in the country, and you have only a few monitoring stations, and so very little transparency, and those monitoring stations are often measuring different pollutants than what the facilities are emitting. And so what we're solving for is, okay, how do we really shed a light on this at a scale that's never been possible before, and at a resolution that's never been possible before, that really makes those disparate impacts clear, measurable, and can create those frameworks for accountability. And so when we think about regulation and standards, one of the things that that is sort of a glaring gap when it comes to the standards that facilities and emitters are being held to, the standards are way behind the science. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, just released a new guidance that shows that the levels of pollution that we should be regulating to are actually much lower, because very small differences in exposure to NO2 or PM2.5 can have huge lifelong impacts. And when you talk about those lifelong impacts, right, compare, and we've measured this, the differences that, for example, schools in Black and Brown communities are being exposed to when they're located next to a freeway corridor. If you're a 6-year-old with asthma, it means that you're missing more days of school. It means that by the time that you graduate, you're starting at a very different starting line than your counterparts in communities that don't have that level of exposure. And so there's these cumulative impacts build up to create a situation that is unjust. And so when we talk about facilitating a just transition, it's not only about having that transparency, that data that helps us really guide major investments like the ones that Ashley was talking about, that the federal government is singularly capable of mobilizing, but also ensuring that as those investments are deployed, that the people that benefit from those investments, that those investments are going into those communities to create local opportunities and local pathways to economic equity as well. So I'll use the example, Michael, of the work that we're doing with Block Power. So a couple of weeks ago, we announced a workforce, a partnership with Block Power, where they're working with us to create great, good local jobs that are, pay living wages with health benefits, to ensure that as we're doing this work, that we're creating economic access and pathways to be able to really invest in those communities at that level, to create those opportunities for job creation. And that it's not just about, like Ashley said, coming in and having people come in and fix the problems for you, but creating those opportunities to really have that self-determination and that economic opportunity really rooted in the community. And with Block Power, as an example, we're using the data that we generate to then highlight which buildings are in need of building decarbonization. So what Block Power does is that they go in and they retrofit buildings to get them off fossil fuels, make them electric, and reduce their carbon footprint. And so they're creating, thousands and thousands of good jobs in actually converting communities and getting communities off of fossil fuels. And it's just one of the examples of how this can really be a win-win-win, and shift away from a model that has historically been extractive and marginalizing to one that really centers community and equity.
And in that zone, so you perfectly tied in the pieces that Ashley was referencing earlier around the workforce. But Davida, just to make sure people can internalize it, you want them to walk away with 3 specific things itself. So walk them through the 1, 2, 3 so they can say and understand what's my assignments from this conversation.
Yeah. Number 1 is demand transparency. Right. So transparency, because transparency creates the frameworks for accountability, and the technologies and the capabilities to do that are here. It's not expensive. This isn't far away. This can be done quickly. So transparency. The other one is to demand for us, one of the things that is critical is that the regulation follows the science. And so when we think about pollution, that it should be grounded in protecting public health, protecting the health of communities. And so that means that, we have to advocate and push for regulation that actually brings those standards down so that we're enforcing and reducing emissions at levels that truly protect public health over the long term. And third, which is to really get at this sort of issue of inequity, is that as we use this kind of transparency and data and frameworks for accountability to target dollars. So when we look at things like Justice 40, right, which is a federal mandate that 40% of the investments made into climate action benefit communities that have historically been underinvested. Well, we want to make sure that those investments are creating local wealth, local jobs, and it's not just sort of a transference of capital to a small set of groups that have historically received the money to go in and deal with the kinds of things that Ashley was talking about in terms of sort of post-destruction capitalism, but sort of really going in and rebuilding with a vision that is community centric and that is really owned at the local level that way.
Demand transparency, regulation follows the science, target the dollars. 3 concrete pieces for us to walk away from here on that. All right, we 3 for 3. I know we're going to be 4 for 4, but we're starting out strong right here. So let me go to the home of hip hop. We've been rocking with everybody else. Let's bring it back to the Bronx right now, and just try to show people what has to go down out here. Just saying. So Rosa, talk to the people about how do we make this plain. You had shared in one of our previous conversations, Greensboro 7, diving in there. What is that, the connection here? What's the radical front that's upon us in this moment to really push us, especially around colleges? Divesting, but again, give us some homework on how do we break the cycle of environmental racism.
So first and foremost, thank you to the gathering and Jules and Carmen, and just, I love these sisters with all my heart. I'm in Albany, New York. So, if former Assemblyman Michael Blake was here, I would be taking him out to dinner or driving you past the house when 20 of us went, when Andrew Cuomo had to walk out in disgrace, as he should have, because I live 1 mile from the mansion. And I wish you were the congressman instead of Richie Torres. That's saying a lot.
That's another conversation for another call right there.
Well, actually, I don't think it is, because if you see his voting record on climate change, as he is one of the impediments of so-called Democrats to getting what young people have been fighting for. First and foremost, I want to shout out Sunrise Movement, right? Like Sunrise Movement and these young folks that were like the day after Biden got elected, or before that, and shutting it down. And as well as Elizabeth Yempierre and Uprose, that has been dealing with climate change for 40 years. And I think that's important because I've covered a couple natural disasters or climate catastrophes. I was in New Orleans 10 days after the Gulf Coast was devastated and the levee breached in New Orleans. I went down there less than 8 months after having my daughter. And a lot of people like, oh my God, you're not even like a year into having your baby. And I'm like, yeah, because like this is about to kill her. So I need to go cover this as an independent journalist. And a couple weeks ago, it's been 4 years since Hurricane Irma and Maria hit Puerto Rico. I have no faith in government. That's why I have a generator, a storage facility with things in my house. I got the gold bag and all of that. I have no faith in government, not because I don't believe people like you who are in government or other people are not our comrades. The system is so chaotic and messed up at this time, and I think what's happening now with the Democrats once again capitulating to crazy Republican sentiment is why this bill that's going to be passed is not going to help us in climate change. And my experience in covering Hurricane Maria was that before Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, you would hear a lot of elders talk about how we could never not be dependent on the US government. But after Donald Trump threw paper towels at our people, they went into complete mutual aid. When you go to Puerto Rico now, there are farms being built, vegan restaurants happening, and over the overthrow of a previous governor, because we cannot depend on government at this time. We're not in a climate catastrophe anymore. We're in the wave of the sixth extinction. That's where we're at. So I don't think there's any policy at this moment that is going to change the trajectory that we're on. But I do believe in the power of people to create mutual aid in their specific communities to save off this onslaught. And the pandemic has shown us exactly what government thinks of us. And not that I want to completely relate to all these people that voted for Trump and QAnon and all that. I think the one thing is fear. And as a mother to a 16-year-old daughter, any issue that I bring up, she's like, if it's not tied to that, the planet and the globe, and we're like, we have disrespected Mother Earth for so long, we're going to now reap the onslaught of that. I might have a different perspective. But as you mentioned about the Greensboro 7, a lot of people don't know the history, particularly Indigenous, African-American, Afro-Latinos, Black Latinos, Asian AOP folks who have always been one with the land. And I've been living in Albany, New York for the last 6 years. And one of the greatest experiences of being here is seeing Soulfire Farm, one of the few farms owned by Black Latino people, of seeing my comrade Omowale Adewole, who bought a farm in Jeffersonville, New York, and he's teaching and having weekends there about how we respect Mother Earth and how when we give and we take around that. But, Indigenous people are leading the way right now, whether it's Standing Rock, whether it was the crisis in Flint, Michigan, whether right now we're finding out that in Benton Harbor for over 2 years, the city the state of Michigan knew they were poisoning, once again, mostly African-American and poor working class people, or what indigenous people have always taught us, that the land is not to be owned, it's to be shared so that we all could survive. So I think what this time calls us now, to be is, how are we going to depend on our blocks, the hood, and as someone from the Bronx, as you know, I'm going to call you Congressman Blake, because that's in my mind what you are to us. My father has had his business for 50 years in the Bronx on Elder Avenue. And he even has taught me how many young people to elders, their lives have been impacted just by asthma, because we're so close to Hunts Point, and it brings me back to also understanding this. It's real simple. When I had earaches, my dad would be like, we don't need to take you to a doctor. I have an aloe vera plant. I'm going to put it in your ear, and your earache is going to be gone tomorrow. Or my mom, I'd be like, why are you saving that in the Cafe Bustelo can? She's like, because we use everything again. We shouldn't just throw things out. So I think we're in a place where young people are asking us as older folks to give them the space to lead this movement. Yesterday, 157 people were arrested in front of the White House, mostly indigenous people, for calling this Democratic administration to task. It was not easy when I was covering Hurricane Katrina, and seeing dead bodies floating. It was not easy to be in Puerto Rico and hear my family and other people tell me stories that they buried people in the back until the bridge was built so they could take them to the coroner. I think that's where we're at. And I would encourage everybody to read a series of New York Times articles where young people are writing. And one of the things I just read recently is that this is the world being left to us by adults. And they talk about these young people like, we don't have time to be nice anymore. We have to put our bodies on the line. And even if we can't physically put our bodies on the line, us here and everyone else, we need to support these young people right now who are literally trying to save the planet so that we could exist. And I would encourage everyone to read Naomi Klein, who coined disaster capitalism. In 1999, me and her met up at the World Trade Organization in Seattle over climate change. In 2005, she was boots on the ground in New Orleans, Mississippi, and Alabama. And then she went to Puerto Rico with Elizabeth Ampere for Uprose, and she talked about the battle for paradise around Puerto Rico. Like, Puerto Rico could either be the first island nation that runs on renewable energies, or it could be the first island nation that disappears. And her essay, The Battle for Paradise, is a little pamphlet. So I look to also people like her. I look to indigenous people. I look to what so many elders are telling us right now, like, we have no choice. All the government policy, the local laws, and lastly, I'll end on this, the increase in policing. So coming after George Floyd, we saw the call for defunding police and abolition. But in this last year, including New York City and LA, we have actually increased the budget for police. And this is why I think we're increasing it. And if anybody wants to go on conspiracy, look, I'm about to be 50, so I'm like a child of the 80s. I'm like, all this shit is conspiracy, but except the vaccine. We should all be vaccinated. But there's going to be an increase for policing because there's going to be a catastrophe of human nature. And police are going to be the ones that contain us in these environments that are physically unsafe because of climate catastrophe. I'm not the first one to say it. Octavia Butler taught us we can read mad books, but the increasing in policing is to keep people contained. while people are not trying to be contained in fighting for a Mother Earth and a planet that we can all live on.
I want to go where you just ended, Rosa. Clearly, we got to rap about the Bronx separately, so we're gonna do that too.
Yeah, I mean, you should be the one running the Bronx, not the other dude.
We're gonna have that conversation. But to where you ended, and I'm gonna do this very brief anecdote because I want this to be where you pick back up, and then I want Rosa to give her answer. I want everybody to jump in on the time here. You know, as everything was jumping off post George Floyd, in the midst of a pandemic, people started to come back out and said, like, enough is enough, right? Like, people were willing to literally put their lives on the line because their lives are on the line, right? And so in that point, the continual impact of climate change, the continual impact of the isms are leading to people saying enough is enough and systems breaking down. From what you're seeing, where do you see the young people saying they want to focus their energy the most as it relates to this environmental injustice and also policing?
Everywhere. You know, like I said, my daughter, who's about to be 17, but all my comrades who are children are now either 10 or 20, you know, and they're like being real honest with us. But the thing with them is they also, right, like, and rightly, when there's climate injustice, there's racial injustice. When there's racial injustice, there's climate injustice. When there's gender injustice, all of it. So that intersectionality. So one organization that I definitely want to make sure I shout out is Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi. And my comrades, Kali and Saki and Brandon from Malcolm X grassroots movement. What they have built in Jackson in the last last decade has not only been a garden, but like, how are we going to sustain our blocks? And every time I talk to Kali, I'll be like, but the world and this, and he's like, if it goes down, do you know that your whole block is safe? And what does that look like? Is your family safe? Do you have a gas mask? And I'm like, oh my God, no. But look, because of Puerto Rico, for me, and covering that and seeing the direct impact on my family, even though I had covered other disasters, like, my parents are about to go to Puerto Rico. And I'm like, y'all need a generator. They're like, what? I'm like, do you not see all the blackouts? Like, you know, because of capitalism. And I think overall, the overarching issue is, unless we deal with capitalism, a lot of the things we're doing might save some people, but it won't save all. So we also have to have that intersectionality of dealing with capitalism as its own disaster. And why this keeps on happening. Why is Biden and them still with fossil fuels? Why are institutions or colleges and universities not already divested? Why do young people have to get arrested? Why do indigenous people have to get arrested? To be like, yo, we're not just trying to save this for us. We're talking about a climate catastrophe that we could potentially reverse if we were all on the same page about humanity and what the United Nations and human rights laws teach us, that we should all have the ability to drink safe water, breathe safe air, and somehow maintain our dignity and lives wherever we are.
And that's that connected to that point of Reverend Warnock, right? COVID-19, COVID-16, that exact point. You should be able to have it all. We should not be deciding between one or the other. 4 for 4, everybody out here knocking it out, killing the game. As expected here. For those just joining us, thank you for joining us on our We Keep Us Safe Climate Justice Town Hall that we have happening here. We're excited. Rosa Clemente, Davida Herzl, Joel Garcia, Ashley Shelton, talking through how we're breaking the mode of environmental injustice and racism. Let's make this family conversation, which it feels like Zoom has become that over the last 20 months, even though we're all ready to actually be chilling around the table. I want each of you, we're gonna get creative here, because we're gonna make this conversation. to toss something to someone else on the panel that you heard them say that you hadn't thought about before, and let the flow of the conversation rock from there. So I want to ring it rock. So I want Ashley to go first on something that you heard from one of the other three, and then let that flow of a conversation as if we're sitting around the table right now. What are we doing to break the isms? So Ashley, take it.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many jewels. Like I have a whole page of notes here from all of the richness of this conversation. I think the creating pods and mutual aid, I think, like there's such a natural, like instead of resilience, like that's actually the beautiful thing that happens, right, in the aftermath of these disasters. But the thing that that I had been looking for the right words for, or the right sentiment, I think, Rosa really hit on this piece around, oil and gas provides 4.5% of the state's GDP, but they control our entire legislative body. And so when you think about, so one of the things that Davida said was, she talked about, like data, right? And so we have so much data on how, we've got how basically how oil and gas is killing us as a state, certainly as communities that are in the midst of that. But like we need leaders with courage and the will, right, to take that data and actually center people in their lives. And so I think that, which then too brings me back to Joel and Rosa again about the young people, right? Like that they're not going to give it to us. Like we got to fight for it. We have to create the space where, like where they have to care. But it was that, like that piece around like that capitalism is driving, like one builds the scarcity narrative, it feeds the scarcity narrative at the same time that it's, sucking the life out of our communities. And so, like that kind of really, that kind of stuck with me. And there's this James Baldwin quote that kind of captures the moment that we're in, and I'll read it really quickly. It just says, "This is the dangerous moment when everything must be reexamined, must be made new, when nothing at all can be taken for granted." And I feel like I keep it close to me because it's just like where I think we are, which is that like we've got lots of pieces, we're building power, there's lots of energy that exists, but it's just like, how do we have enough power to really, move and get to where we want to? And Maurice, I'm pretty sure another Brooklynite, with the Working Families Party, said something really beautiful the other day, which was, like, again, like the courage and the vision that we're looking for to get to the places that we want to be. It's going to come from our young people, and it's also going to come from us thinking outside of the box. And so, and so Rosa, that last piece where you just talked about, but like, is your block going to be okay? Is your unit going to be okay? And, like, there's something comforting about that. There's something about like, yeah, like it's overwhelming if we think about the whole world, but if I take it, small pieces at a time, we can really make a difference. And so, yeah, they're just a powerful conversation.
Yeah, I want to go off of something Rosa said, and I gotta credit Carlton Turner out at from Sip Culture down in Utica, Mississippi, who planted this in my head. And in doing a lot of the isms that exist within like the climate crisis, climate justice movement, is undoing this idea that Black folks are relegated to the city, and that Black folks don't have a connection to the land. So look up Carlton Turner, Sip Culture, SIPP Culture down in Utica, Mississippi. And this was a conversation about like relationships between Black and Indigenous folks. So I also don't want whiteness to contain our indigeneity within how we define Indigenous folks within the definitions of Native Americans within the constructs of the US. Let me repeat that again. Let's not whiteness define our indigeneity as Indigenous people based on the definition of tribal nations within the US. Yes, we got to respect the sovereignty of those tribal nations and support their self-determination. But as Indigenous people, it's a big umbrella term. This also applies to Black folks. And being an Indigenous person is defined by our connection to the land. And in this case, right, we're talking about this continent. So there is power in identifying as an Indigenous person on this continent, and the agency that we should move about here. But being an indigenous person is also about a set of values, a value system which we operate off of. And I think it's that shift in the climate work that we need to do as indigenous people from all over the globe, right? Black folks indigenous to Africa. Like, it is that indigeneity that is gonna lead the way. And so as indigenous folks, we get brought into these conversations, these conferences and all these things, mainly to always like decorate the space, right? Do the opening prayer, do the land acknowledgement, like we're acknowledging that we're on our own land, like that kind of stuff. But I think it is that mental shift of like, let's look back at our indigenous values as tribal peoples, right? As people connected to the land. Farming, right? Black folks farm. This idea that Black folks don't farm is nonsense. This idea that Black folks, that farmers that came from Africa, right, through the slave trade did not connect with indigenous folks here and share knowledge and build what like these plantations ripped off of, right? Like these farming techniques. Like, let's go back to that. Let's remember those things. So undoing this myth that Black folks are relegated to cities, this urban title. Like, let's work on those things. And for us, for folks who identify as indigenous folks within these spaces, stop serving as like the opening prayer, stop serving as like the land acknowledgement. If you get invited to these things at the tail end of like how they get designed, say like, no, let's start from scratch because we got things we want to say. We got ideas we want to put on the table. So thank you, Rosa, for like sparking that. And you know, I hope that's helpful.
You know, Joel, I'm glad you said that, because the land acknowledgement, as someone I would normally, like many of us, being in the concrete spaces and been on Zoom for 18 months, and super grateful that I could do this work this way. A month ago, my dear sister Conrad, Dr. Melina Abdullah, who was right there where BLM started and has really bought BLM LA. They're actually in London right now receiving a Human Rights Award. She came up here because in Albany, we're 2 hours from Auburn, where Harriet Tubman built a house, and 3 hours from Rochester. And I always tell people, particularly in New York State, they think that New York City is the state. But once you cross into the counties of, quote, upstate, the amount of land, right? And that we're also on indigenous land. I went to Cornell University, that's Sacandaga land. Like, you know, we know that. And she asked me, she goes, what do you think of the land acknowledgements? I'm like, yo, I'm good if they give the land back to indigenous people. Like, right? Like, it's like me. I don't need to be acknowledged as a Black Puerto Rican, and you're still making things that kill that in me. You know what I'm saying? Like, but also what you just said about the idea of what an urban community looks like. Yo, mad people don't understand that there was enslavement in upstate New York and in Massachusetts. But one of the things about everyone who got free, including Harriet Tubman, the reason she built the house where she built was she's like, unless I build it, they're going to erase us. And I need to work with the indigenous people on this land. So I think that's like critically important for us to realize these geographical spaces and how things work geographically. But, you know, you brought it up, and I'll say it again. One of the best things about me being here is I could be in 40 minutes at Soulfire Farm. I could be in 30 minutes at Liberation Farm. And it's really changed my thinking around like what ownership looks like, because so many of us are shamed if we don't own a house. But what does that mean to own something? What does that mean to have a house and only 2 people in it? Like, those are the things I think about, you know? And lastly, as artists, which you spoke about, Joe, I think our politics leads the art. The artists will put out the politic that we're like, we need to talk about this. And we see younger artists, they might not be the most politically astute words or whatever, but if you listen to them, all of them are questioning, like, what is the longevity of me on this earth? And what does that look like? So as an artist, I'm not an artist, but you as an artist, I so respect the ability for artists to be able to capitulate something in like 3 to 5 minutes, and that young people will gravitate towards that. So I think we have to think about mutual aid and this idea of ownership for who and for what. These are questions I ask myself, you know.
And I was just gonna say just some reflections, and I'm walking away with so much. And one of the things that I'm walking away with is, you know, Rosa, you as a society, we're not calling it what it is, right? This idea that we call it the climate crisis is actually not fully reflecting what's happening, and it should be referred to as the sixth extinction. We are wiping out life on this earth. The other day, I don't know if you saw the headline, but there was a news story that the American bumblebee is getting put on the endangered list, and we are, you know, we're stuck in these sort of political conversations, and we're not, or our politicians are stuck in these conversations and not talking about what is actually happening. But that is the foundation of life. That is the foundation of all of the food that we eat, the pollinators, right? And we just don't acknowledge the collapse that's taking place. And so I walk away from this sort of inspired to call it what it is, because that is what it is. And the other thing that I'm walking away with is just this idea of sort of shifting. I think we all, you know, sort of proactively calling out sort of what values are we bringing to the table as we're having the conversations about how we confront the sixth extinction, and that it's bigger than just our own survival, that we are, you know, having this bigger impact on the web of life, but talking about how we shift into operating from a different set of values. And it is, I mean, I have to admit, you know, to this, it is very, very, very hard work. But if we don't, if we're not intentional about making that shift, we will never get there. And so, Joel, I wanted to thank you for speaking to that. I thought that was really, really powerful.
You know, my Jamaican blood usually tries to avoid bees, but now you got me thinking about bumblebees in a good way right there. And how that was framed around the sixth extension that, of course, Rosa made mention of, and the interconnectedness of this all. You know, Ashley, you know, as a DeWitt Clinton alum, I always got love for anything about James Baldwin. Anytime I hear Baldwin, I'm like, it just makes us all better in that manner. And to Joel, the framing of, you know, let's not be relegated to the cities, you know, and the amount of conversations that we've been having. I remember a few, you know, about 10 plus years ago, spending time with the Black farmers, and they were just like, look, stop treating us as if we only live in the cities. You know, Black folk are living everywhere. And the deeper conversation that could be a whole other town hall is Black is not just African American, right? And how we have that appreciation of that moment there. We got 9 minutes to go. I want to do call to action. I want people to leave with a real clear, where do I go from here? And I also think it's important, because we don't do this enough, let people know what you are working on and how they can mobilize around that. Because again, it doesn't matter if we're just talking about it if people can't mobilize from here. So what is that call to action? Is there a petition? Is there a mobilization? Is there something that's coming up that's happening? You know, Rosa, you made mention of DC. I was in DC. I just came back from DC. I literally got my suitcase next to me. And I taught my class yesterday looking out on what was going on in the White House, what was going on out in Treasury, so that you can visualize our people out here saying enough is enough. And so in that manner, let's switch it up in this order. Davida first, Joel, Ashley, then Rosa. A call to action. What is that thing you want people to mobilize around, and how do they stay connected to you? And everyone, let this be your closing answer. So make sure you can lead people with the ways to follow up from here with you. Davida first.
So I would say, in terms of call to action, I mean, I think all eyes on the White House, and demanding that, you know, following the path of where what the youth is demanding, listening to them and following their path 100%. I think we're in a critical window when we need to collectively get behind them and listen to what they're asking for and demand it with them. So that's sort of, I think, a general call. In terms of our work, we are, you know, partnering with communities across the country in the areas of the country that are most impacted by emissions, and working together to to ensure that those frameworks of accountability are there, and pulling together the working with communities to work to create those resources to demand and hold folks accountable. And I can post my email, and anybody can reach me if they want to work on developing those tools together. But that's how we're partnering with folks, Michael.
And for anyone that might have joined late, how do they find out about Aclima, and what's your social handle?
Yeah, so you can follow us at Aclima, follow me at Davida Herzl on Twitter, and reach out to us at hello@aclima.io.
There you go. I'm a practical organizer. Joel, take it away.
I got to uplift something that's happening at the moment. So Apache Stronghold, look them up online, Apache-Stronghold. This is the ways in which the US weaponizes these systems against us, right? Like how folks in California get to influence what happens in Arizona is beyond me, right? But they have a court hearing coming up at the end of the month. They're on a spiritual convoy at the moment. They're coming here to Los Angeles this weekend. And this court case will determine whether the US government is able to hand off this piece of land, this sacred land, to a mining company. Why it's included as part of a defense bill, who knows? But these are the ways in which the US mobilizes. So look them up, Apache Stronghold. Email who's listed there, let them know to return this land to the Apache tribe. What I'm doing now, I'm part of an organization called Meztli Projects, MEZTLI. And I like to say, I think in the simplest form, is that we use art-based strategies to reduce violence. And that catches people's attention, like, well, what do you mean? Street violence as well as environmental violence. Like what's happening to us is violent. So some of the stuff that we're doing is like, kind of where art and wellness come together. So we like to change language, to Rosa's point about ownership. One of the things that I've been encouraging folks to use around this idea of like taking care of homes is the concept of stewardship. And when we shift that notion of ownership to stewardship, it encompasses so much more, right? It encompasses this idea of caring and caring for one another. You're carrying this home for future generations. They're carrying this home for when it might get returned to Native folks at one point. So Meztli Projects, it's MEZTLI projects.org, or on Instagram, Meztli Projects. You can find me and my work at Rage1 on Instagram. And we like to see ourselves as like disruptors and instigators when it comes to this work, asking a lot more questions and coming with answers.
Incredible. Ashley.
Yeah, again, thanks to everyone for this discussion. Like it's been so powerful. I think for me, a couple of calls to action. One, that we need a national response and solution to disasters. It cannot be what it has been and what it continues to be. And so, everyone keeps telling me all the things that take an act of Congress. I said, well, they've been in Congress and they've been acting a fool a whole lot. And so I don't know why we can't get Congress to act on behalf of the people that they're supposed to represent. And so write your legislators, call your legislators. 85% of the people in this country live in some type of disaster-prone area, whether it's fire, whether it's hurricanes, whether it's tornadoes, flooding. We've been seeing it all over the country. This is a real issue for all of us, not just those of us in the South. We saw Ida go from South Louisiana all the way to Newark and New York. And so these are real issues that we all have to confront and face and fight for, and not just the response, but also too on the front end, to Davida's point, but also too to listen to the data, listen to what the air is telling us, listen to what the earth is telling us. I would be remiss if I didn't lift up some of the warriors here in Louisiana. Sharon with Rise St. James, who is, fighting this valiant fight against this huge billion-dollar company, Formosa, and keeping them out of her community. 2 weeks, she kind of gave them almost a fatal body blow, and then Ida hit, right? And so she's lost everything. And so we have to also remember that for those that put it all on the line and fight for environmental justice and change are also just regular everyday people that took up this mantle, and that we have to make sure that we provide support to those organizations and those folks that get up every single day and fight this fight. And so Sharon is one of my sheroes, and so I wanted to lift her up, but also too Louisiana Bucket Brigade and so many others that are doing great work to fight this fight. Power Coalition, you can go to our website. We just dropped our roadmap to recovery, where we again offer up lots of ideas around how we can use government funds to do all kinds of things that would actually be helpful to community. And that's at powercoalition.org. And you can also check us out at PowerCoEJ on all of our social media handles. That's on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And then you can check me out at Ashley K. Shelton on Twitter. And so again, proud to be here and be a part of this conversation. Excited to be thinking with all of you on how we continue to fight and create long-term solutions. And I also feel like I think it's important that I agree, Rosa. Like I've got 16 years of seeing what government can and cannot do or just won't do, and so I don't trust government. But I also feel like as a taxpayer, where is my money? Why are my communities not whole? What's happening? And so there's this piece around power and accountability that I think we're going to continue to have to just beat that drum until the momentum and the sound is so powerful that it cannot be not listened to. And so thank you for having me today.
Incredibly powerful. And as we go to Rosa, Ashley mentioned 85%, another 85% reference. Washington Post article just referenced 85% of the world population being affected by climate change, of course, in that same manner. It's 85% in both of those pieces. Rosa, to bring us home.
Yeah, I mean, I believe in reading, young folks. So read The Sixth Extinction, not to bum you out. It gives you a lot of lessons. And I love Naomi's a comrade. I think she's been honest before so many of us, and this battle for paradise in Puerto Rico. I also believe that we should begin to link our work against policing to climate change. And I would encourage people to follow Sunrise Movements, Soulfire Farm, Cooperation Jackson. In fact, one of the founders just walked into my house, but he's out there already doing work. I was going to bring him in, and as a board member of Cooperation Jackson, this idea of mutual aid is so critically important. And actually, I think you're absolutely right about holding government accountable. And I'm gonna leave it to other people. I think it's important to understand what our role is. I've moved on from electoral politics, but I don't denunciate it. I think it's critically important for me to support younger people and anybody who's doing that work. And then like that whole adage of in the streets, I don't like in the streets, but in the streets, and that I have a deep respect with people who can literally be lobbying, in Congress, in their state and whatever for doing that work. I think it's important as an organizer and an activist, you begin to find out, where am I more effective? Who can I support? And what's the bigger issue? So once again, thank you for the gathering, for having this, because I think it is critically important that we begin to look at policing and state violence and in turn, how we may be seeing more of that as we are in this climate catastrophe, but also we're seeing younger people who are putting their bodies on the line and just willing to sacrifice maybe more than we have as adults after 35.
Exactly, after 35. We got to show love to Rosa, to Joel, to Ashley, to Davida. Thank you immensely. Gems for days. I've been taking crazy amount of notes, and we got to make sure we got to stay connected. That's nothing that doesn't happen after these panels. You have these conversations, then you don't rap with people afterwards. consistently to keep building. To everyone that joined at home, thank you for joining us for We Keep Us Safe. Shout out to Jules Hoffenberg, who got us all organized behind the scenes. It was
man. I love Jules. I'm gonna ride with Jules to the end of the day.
All day, every day.
All day, every day.
A critical conversation that was pulled together. Of course, much love to our dear sister Comfort Jordan and her leadership, and everyone at the gathering, and of course, all love every day to Mr. B, to Harry Belafonte, all that he continues to do. Follow these incredible organizers, everybody. Stay connected. Let's keep building. To keep up to date on the work, follow NY Justice League. NY Justice League. Follow that. Also, Gather for Justice. Gather for Justice. The number 4 on Twitter and Instagram. Finally, we need your support for programs to keep this rocking. So if you can, every donation matters for the gathering. Cash App, obviously, the $, gathering number 4 Justice. Texting the gathering to 44321. 44321, forgive me. Text the gathering to 44321. I'm a politician. We're always ready to ask for money out here for good causes, though, right? Or go to gatheringforjustice.org and mobilize in that way. We got a lot of love for everybody. So much was taken down. We recorded this conversation, and block was mentioned a lot of times. Let me leave you with the line that I say often to people around me. Your block won't block your blessing. Your zip code won't deny your destiny. Your block won't block your blessing. Your zip code won't deny your destiny. So let's be engaged. Let's keep rocking. Let's keep building. Let's save our people. So let's keep ourselves safe. We keep ourselves safe. And on behalf of the Gathering for Justice, we say thank you and good night.